Hello everyone, I'm JG and welcome back to MusicForever, where today I'm bringing you guys a brand new track review video where I talk about several recently released songs I happen to hear and have some opinions on. You guys know the drill by this point, so I'm just going to get right into things. The first couple of tracks I want to talk about are these new singles from Drake that were released following the Toronto Raptors victory in the NBA Finals. I'm not super familiar with basketball and things like that, so I don't have much to say on that front of things, but given that Drake is from Toronto, I guess these tracks were released as kind of like a victory celebration, if you will. So the first of these two tracks, Omertà, is one that overall I think is pretty underwhelming. I'm not a big Drake fan by any means. If you guys have been following my channel, you probably know this already. But this track really just embodies a lot of the stuff that I haven't really cared from Drake in recent years. Just a really boring, monotonous, uninteresting flow, boring, uninteresting beats, lyrics that aren't really all that great either. You have Drake acting really braggadocious here on this track, which is something that just doesn't really work out all that nicely, especially when he's doing things like referencing the Pusha T beef from last year and saying things like this event caused Pusha T's career to have like a second wind or something like that, which really isn't the case. Pusha T has always been rather respected in hip-hop. I mean, of course, he's not as popular as Drake or anything like that, but to say that it gave his career like a second wind or more popularity or something like that wouldn't really be true. And especially given how much Pusha T destroyed Drake during that beef, the fact that Drake is still referencing it here on this song like a year later is just kind of mind-boggling. Like, why would you continue to bring this up instead of just sweeping it under the rug, which is probably what you should be doing and focusing on the future instead. But the fact that Drake is bringing stuff like this up here on this track where he's trying to brag, it really doesn't make him come across all that genuine, and as a result, the lyrics just don't really have much of an impact. So yeah, the track overall is pretty uninteresting. Maybe if Drake focused more on bragging about the victory of the Toronto Raptors, maybe that would have been some interesting or at least different subject matter, but that's not really the case here on this song. The second of the two new tracks he dropped is Money in the Grave, which once again is pretty underwhelming, pretty uninteresting sounding. Once again, Drake's verses here are just pretty forgettable and uninteresting, probably even more so than the first track. You do have a verse from Rick Ross on this thing, which at least does change the track up slightly, given that Ross's inflection and flow here on this track is different than Drake's. However, his verse isn't particularly memorable or interesting either. The beat isn't super memorable or interesting either, and neither is the hook to the track too. It's just another pretty forgettable track overall. So yeah, I really don't have much else to say about this song. It's just a really mediocre, forgettable Drake song that probably most people won't remember in a couple months. So yeah, moving on from this new influx of Drake tracks, I do want to talk about the newest track from Pallbearer, Atlantis. I did like Pallbearer's last album quite a bit, so I was looking forward to hearing this new song of theirs. And overall, I think it's an okay cut. I don't think it's quite as good as some of the material they dropped on that last project from 2017, but it's still a pretty okay song at the end of the day. My favorite aspect of this track overall is probably the guitar work, especially the guitar soloing. It has that emotional quality to it that I just feel is very typical of Pallbearer, but it's something that I think they pull off very nicely. And a lot of the guitar soloing here on this track, as well as the other guitar parts, just sound really nice here on this song. They're definitely the best part in my opinion. Unfortunately, I don't think the rest of the track really has that much else going on for it that's super exciting or groundbreaking or new for this band or doom metal at large or anything quite like that. I will say the vocals also have that very sorrowful feel to them that I think makes Pallbearer's music kind of unique. But, you know, aside from that, this track really doesn't have that much else interesting going on for it. Not one of the most memorable cuts to come out of this band's discography, but still a pretty solid one. If you're a fan of the band, I would recommend checking this out. But if you haven't listened to this band, I'd definitely start with their 2017 album instead. Moving on, the next song I want to talk about is this new single from Sum 41, Never There. Overall, this is definitely an interesting change of pace for the band, being a ballad track coming after a couple of more straightforward, aggressive pop-punk singles that they've dropped. However, I do think that this is possibly the best single that they've dropped so far from their upcoming record, especially due to the lyrics here on this thing, which talk about Derek Whibley, the lead singer of the band, and his lack of a father figure in his life, considering the fact that his father was never there for him in his life, and that he never knew his father. He talks about having some sort of strange connection to his father as a result of this, and he also talks about being kind of happy with how things turned out, considering that he's been able to make it on his own without a father. It's an interesting story. It's not one I could say I relate to myself, considering I did grow up with a father, but it still is really something special, I feel. And I think that his performance here on this track when it comes to delivering these lyrics really does help sell them at the end of the day. and the combination of the vocals and the lyrics here on this track are definitely the highlight. When it comes to the instrumental on this thing, on the other hand, I do think it is a little bit lacking in comparison. It's kind of your more traditional pop-punk ballad instrumental that you've probably heard something similar to before. However, given the fact that the lyrics are supposed to be the highlight of this track and the focus, I don't think it's a super terrible thing that the instrumental to this track isn't quite as ear-grabbing. I think that the vocals and the lyrics that they're, singing about are supposed to be the highlight here, and this track kind of plays things accordingly. So yeah, overall, Never There is a pretty great cut from Sum 41. Probably one of their best ballad cuts to date. So if you're a Sum 41 fan, definitely give this track a listen, because overall, it's one that I think is pretty solid. Moving on, the next track we're going to talk about actually comes from another pop-punk band, Blink-182 with Generational Divide. I didn't expect a track like this to be the second single from their upcoming album, considering the first track was a really poppy cut, one that I didn't really like at all if you saw my track review of it. This, on the other hand, is a very short, less than a minute long, to-the-point pop-punk song that is kind of reminiscent of some of those short joke tracks that they included in California, but it's a bit more serious overall, I guess, and it's a bit less poppy too, I guess you could say, as well. I like this track a fair bit more than Blame It On My Youth. However, it's still not a really memorable or interesting track. Not really because it's necessarily a short song, because there's plenty of short songs out there, especially in punk and its subgenres, that I really enjoy. It's just that this one in particular isn't all that exciting or interesting. The instrumental is pretty standard for Blink-182, nothing too awful, but at the same time nothing too great either. The vocal performances aren't that great either. Mark Hoppus kind of sounds like he's on autopilot. Matt Skiba's vocals kind of have this weird effect on them that just doesn't sound right or good. The lyrics on this track aren't all that standout either. Apparently they're supposed to be about kind of reacting to a lot of the fans' reactions to their last single, as well as California by extension, for being too poppy, and the band is kind of, a little upset about this, I guess you can say, and kind of making a joke out of it here on this song. And I mean, I'm not sure if that's the exact interpretation of this song as how the band intended it to be, but I've seen several people on the internet and places like that kind of say that this is the possible interpretation of the song. And I can certainly see it in the lyrics here. I mean, if this is what the lyrics are about, I mean, it's kind of petty and not really in a good way, but at the same time, I guess it is short enough to not really bother me all that much. At least they didn't make a whole freaking album about it, Eminem, but yeah, there's not much to say about this song, honestly. I can probably go into a deeper analysis of the lyrics, but I'd just be wasting my time at that point. So, yeah, only check this out if you're a big Blink fan, because if not, it really has very little to offer you. Moving on, though, the next track I want to talk about comes from Simple Creatures, the collaborative project between Mark Hoppus of Blink-182 and Alex Gaskarth of All Time Low. I reviewed their debut EP earlier this year, which, as I said in my review of that, was one of my least favorite projects I've heard all year, and probably one of the most generic pop rock, whatever you want to call it, albums or EPs I've heard, ever. So I didn't really have much high hopes for this band coming into any more singles or projects, but I decided to check out their new single, Special, anyways, just to see how it was. And overall, yeah, it's just more of the same pretty much from what they were going for on that EP that they dropped earlier this year. It's more really overproduced pop rock to the point where it's not even really rock anymore. You just have a bunch of loud electronic instrumentals that are pretty annoying and boring. You have vocal performances from both Mark and Alex that are pretty underwhelming and uninteresting as well. Auto-tuned to the point of just having no emotion or really anything worth caring about. The lyrics are just chock full of cliches once again, much like a lot of the other lyrics that the band has done before in the past too. And just once again, I'm left kind of dumbfounded by the fact that these two musicians that come from bands that I do like to varying extents, that have clearly shown themselves to be talented and competent songwriters in the past, have been able to come together in this musical project, but instead of making content that's better than what they've done on their own or with their own projects, make something that is just so mind-numbingly boring and generic. I just don't understand how it works at all. So yeah, don't recommend this song, it's terrible. Let's talk about something a bit better though with the next track I'm going to talk about, this new single from Big K.R.I.T, Addiction. I think this is a pretty solid track overall. Not one of Big K.R.I.T's best or anything, but it's a pretty nice track at the end of the day. I like the beat on this thing, I like the bass on it in particular. It sounds very smooth, it sounds very sexy as well, which given that this track is, all about sex, I guess it makes sense at the end of the day. I like Big K.R.I.T's flow on this track. I think Lil Wayne has a great verse on this thing as well. I think the hook on this track is pretty catchy and it just fits perfectly into the vibe that this track is going for. Lyrically, the song isn't super deep or anything quite like that, given that, like I said before, it's pretty much all about sex. But as far as a sex song goes, it's a bit more creative than many that are out there. And I think from Big K.R.I.T, coming off the last single from his upcoming album, which I thought was decent but kind of generic, I think this one's a bit more interesting overall, and I'm a bit more excited to see what his upcoming album has in store, if it's going to be more like this. Once again, I don't think this is one of Big K.R.I.T's best songs necessarily, but I like what this track is going for. I think it has a nice vibe to it as well. Overall, a really solid track. Moving on, the next track we're going to be talking about is the newest single from Korn, You'll Never Find Me. Overall, I think this track is pretty standard Korn for this point in their career. They're doing their typical nu metal sound that they've kind of brought back to the forefront in the band in their last few albums, and they're doing it pretty standardly, I guess you could say. I would say that of all the nu metal bands out there, Korn are probably one of the stronger ones, but this track is just a bit too typical for my taste, I guess. You do have some nice heavy instrumentation here on this thing. Nothing too complex or anything like that, but it has that heavy, dark atmosphere that I do like from the band, and I do think it's a pretty solid instrumental at the very least. And I think the pre-chorus here on this song is pretty solid as well. It gets me really hyped up in a way for whatever the chorus is going to bring later on. It's just a shame that the hook here on this track itself isn't one that's particularly memorable or exciting or catchy or anything. It does kind of feel like the pre-chorus is building up to something greater than what you actually get here on the song, given that the hook is kind of awkward and not really all that memorable. And the lyrics on this track are just kind of typical by Korn standards, you know, kind of edgy and all of that stuff that you would expect from the band. Not something that I'm super against given the band that's making it, but it's just a bit standard for the band at this point. It's not all too memorable. So yeah, I think this track is pretty typical for the band. It does have some nice elements to it, but nothing about this track really stands out to me as being all that great or worth returning to in the long run. Not awful, but not great either. I think this is a pretty average track. Finally, the last track I want to talk about here today is the newest single from King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard, Oregon Farmer. I think overall this is a nice addition to King Gizzard's newest collection of thrash metal themed tracks from their upcoming studio album. I think once again the band has a nice control over the thrash metal genre while still being able to incorporate some of the more typical elements into them, like some kind of stoner metal-esque sounds into the guitar riffs here on this thing, even if they are very thrashy in nature. Lyrically, the track is just really chaotic as well, in a way that is just very King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard. Overall, I don't think this track is quite as memorable as, say, Planet B or Self-Immolate, but I still think overall it's a nice track. I like the guitar work here on this thing. I think the solos are really nice as well, and it's just a nice addition to the band's sound. So yeah, once again, I'm really excited to see what the band does on this upcoming album of theirs coming out this August. But with that said, that concludes everything I want to talk about here in today's video, all the tracks I want to cover. It is just my own personal opinion though, so if you happen to disagree, that's perfectly fine. In fact, feel free to leave your own thoughts on any of the tracks I mentioned before in the comment section down below. And while you're down there, make sure you leave a like on the video and subscribe to the channel for more music-related content, things like album reviews, track reviews, all that kind of content. So if you enjoy it, make sure you subscribe. Thank you for watching once again, and stay golden.